everybody. Welcome back to yet another episode of Animation Dissection, brought to you by Ennui. For your next existential nightmare, why not try the creeping sense of existence pointlessness wrapped in a gray fog of ambivalence? Ennui. I am Neeksy, here of course with Zorak, and today we have a special guest. I guess we'll just go by Dicktron.
Yep.
So, Dicktron had written to us requesting that we cover Ghost in the Shell standalone complex, so that will be
about 2 years ago.
yeah, we're a bit slow on the uptake.
Look, we've been too busy trying to think about how she so perfectly surfs. How does she so perfectly surf? I wonder what she does when she gets up.
I'm smelling lithium now.
I have absolutely no idea what you guys are talking about, but I'll just go with it. So, but
Sounds like someone didn't listen to the ending theme every time.
Yeah, my patience kind of.
It's a good ending theme.
She's so perfectly math, Neeksy.
I know, but having to sit through that every single time.
Is she really human, or is she just something new?
Would you call it
it's
prog
something
rock?
Humans do.
Was that the genre? What the fuck music style was that?
I mean,
it was pretty math, I'll tell you that.
Either way. So before that, let's do some quick animation news. Only thing I got is kind of just crapping on Nickelodeon, because they are at it again, trying really, really hard to make this 90s Nicktoon crossover movie that they're kind of trying to pretend it's like the Avengers. But this time, now there's details, like it's being directed by Jared Hess, the Napoleon Dynamite guy. That's it. That's all we know. And also in desperate news, the new Fairly Odd Parents series is... Just, dear God, I mean, this is not even nostalgia talking. Like, I wasn't, like, a giant fan of the series, but, like, this is just genuinely bad on its own terms. So, like, the new intro's out, the new character design, just the idea feels like it's Poochie, the rockin' dog, just in a new form. It's just...
Remember back in the day when you liked Pinky and the Brain a whole bunch, and then there was that like year where no new episodes happened, and then a year later it showed up again, and it was Pinky and the Brain and Elmira, and it absolutely tanked after that point in being any kind of good ever.
Yeah.
It's probably that's what that's going to happen.
Well, but here's the thing: is this isn't the first time they've done that. Every time it's come back, they have added new characters. So then they had the baby Poof. That was their next desperate, like, I guess. What was that character in the Flintstones? The alien.
The Great Gazoo.
Yeah,
I think
that was their Great Gazoo. Then
you
they
take that back. The
dog.
Great Gazoo was great. Gazoo.
It was in his name.
I know. That's how you know he's good.
Would Hanna-Barbera lie to us by not making him great, guys? Would they lie? What would they have to gain?
Another character in their ridiculously large number of characters that are entirely forgettable.
Yes. So
what about when he does a Jetsons crossover, huh?
I smell cheap cartoon crossover. But either way, so they've decided to change the premise, I guess, by adding a female character who is very over-designed, and it seems like a DeviantArt fan character in that style, and apparently now Timmy has to share the parents with her. It's just... Here's a new thing! Please don't notice we don't have any new cartoons. So, yeah, Nickelodeon, I really don't know what they're doing. They seem to be kind of in a tailspin creatively. I
mean, they're up against what Cartoon Network is now, where almost every single new show that they've done has been really successful.
Yeah.
But you'd think that would be like a sign that they have an opportunity. Like, oh yeah, they're doing this shit. Maybe we should also do shit.
They probably should be doing that, where they should bring in some new talent and make new stuff, but they're actually doing the opposite of that, and they're sticking to their guns and seeing if that will pay off.
Well, they are kind of trying to introduce new talent, so they just opened up submissions for their new shorts program, and then they hope that from the shorts programs, they'll be able to have a pilot for a new series. The only problem with that is very few of them have been developed into actual TV series, and the ones that have either... really did poorly, like Breadwinners, or
Mhm.
they got strangled in the crib by just really bad just executive leadership. So
I mean,
I
that
would
seems kind of be the problem with them in general because they had something that was doing really well for them for a while, and it was called Avatar, and then they fucking killed it. It's like they had something good that was totally different from anything that like Cartoon Network was doing, and then they
Mhm.
fucking murdered it.
yes.
Fucking like stuck a
In
knife in
the
it.
crib. I mean, with the second version of it, so that series, they had cut the order short. They didn't let them know how long they were going to support it in terms of number of seasons. Also,
Every time.
yeah, every single time.
Every
So
single time they got a new like season, they got like, okay, we have another 12 episodes. So we have to wrap it up again in 12 episodes because we don't know if we're going to get anything else. And then they did that 3 more times after that first one.
yeah, so imagine having come from the first Avatar series where they're like, okay, you called them books, like as in the sense that
Mhm.
you had these things planned out for 4 seasons and you had a whole bunch of episodes and all sorts of decent support in doing it and it became really successful. Imagine being a creator of that and then going, okay, we're going to give you another series. Good luck, go fuck yourself. Like that seems to be kind of what they were given, and it's just then you also have what's happened with Harvey Beaks, where they're just going like, we're just going to keep shifting around the schedule between random SpongeBob reruns and then hope that gains an audience. Good luck. It's just a lot of just bad. I mean, they're trying to grab new artists and pull them in, but then once they're in, they don't support them in any way.
It's especially bad in bringing up Avatar again because when Avatar ended, it actually that for them it looked up really up. They started their own like animation studio and production company. They they hadn't done anything for a while, and they announced Legend of Korra. I think Korra. I forget what the full title of it is. I actually only watched first season of it. Um, and then they finally announced Korra, and well, we then later learned that they only get the 12 episodes, which they only learned like halfway through the series, and that's why that first season like takes a like tank in quality halfway through
Well, yeah, because
for the writing. I mean,
they also switched to Studio Piero.
yeah, I mean specifically for the first season of it. For
Oh,
the
right.
second season of it, they lost even more money, and they had to switch over to Studio Piero, who literally never animated any of the characters blinking.
Yeah, that was a big thing I remember is like no one blinks anymore. This is starting to get really weird. And then they switched to Studio Mirror, so all the animation quality came back. But by that time, Nickelodeon had so screwed over the show in terms of like, well, how do you find new episodes? Are they going to do new episodes?
They stopped airing it on TV. They put it onto their
Yeah,
site only.
yeah, exactly. It was
Which is
just
so fucking just like that is like the outright like, bullet in the head. Like we're not even giving you a
That
fucking chance.
Yeah, that is like series burial right there because that wasn't like put on for free, for free distribution or anything in an attempt to get more views out of it. That was to make it so that they didn't have to air it on TV. Period.
yeah.
Because it would take up rerun time, I guess.
Well, because that's all they really got. I mean, other than that CG version of Ninja Turtles, that's the only other show I think of that has been fairly recent that's been somewhat successful for them. Because
I wasn't even sure I didn't even know that show existed that you're just talking
Is
about
that
right
on?
now.
Is that on, Nick?
that's Nickelodeon. Yeah, that's the only
Okay.
other one that I can think of that's been successful in that regard. Otherwise, they've been having to revive Fairly Odd Parents every once in a while after it gets canceled. Like it's been canceled like 2 times, I think, and this is like the third revival of it. And then they had the weird live action movie versions of it and all sorts of weird shit. And then they keep on doing SpongeBob forever, and I don't know of anybody who really likes it anymore. So I have no idea. I just don't know. They could do all the shorts programs they like. They can have all the talented people try to get the shorts and produce little pilots and things like that they like. But when you have managerial incompetence and just a lack of vision, that's kind of what happens. And I think that's been Nickelodeon's problem is it's a lack of vision from the higher ups. Like a lot of their when you try to submit for their shorts programs, they pretty much tell you what they want ahead of time. They don't really have as much an openness for style or content or genre that you're really seeing. So that's yeah. I mean, we'll see.
Sounds like they really have no idea what they're doing then.
That's why it feels just desperation. in a lot of
So
ways.
the question I have at that point is like, what is going to happen to Nickelodeon? Are they going to manage to hold on just based off of SpongeBob reruns, or is there a real possibility that Nick is going to fucking die?
I don't think Nick is going to die in the same sense because it's still Viacom, and Viacom will probably pump as much money into it because it's as a brand,
I mean,
it still
they could
exists.
theoretically like cycle it into being, I don't know, something else entirely.
They could.
Or maybe they could.
They also have
or
the
maybe
live action
Viacom
shit they've
could
been doing.
fire this Nick staff, which
Could be, but I have no idea. Either way, I feel like fairly cynical when I look at a lot of these like Nick Shorts programs that are coming out, and it's not for a lack of quality of the shorts per se. It's really just, oh, I don't have faith that even the good ones are going to be implemented and treated right. Is really
Oh, I'm
what
so
the problem
sorry
is.
that you're on. You have to be put on through this instead of something like more worthwhile.
Yeah.
Well, or it's not like more worthwhile. It's more like, well, it's like I'm sad that the opportunity they gave you is going to be to have them then just kill your show because they just don't know what they're doing.
Yeah, that's more what I meant.
Yeah.
But you got it.
Because again, it's not about the quality of the actual animation or the shorts themselves. Although, like I think in some cases there is a lack of just vision in terms of we want animated comedy ages 8 to 12, only little kid characters, science, tech, math as a basis for. I mean, it's just like every year they'll come up with a new set of standards that they want. Like they'll pretty much tell you like they pretty much design the show and then they just want you to plug a style into it.
Work the Rugrats into this somehow.
Yeah, it's kind of like that. I mean, it's not that bad, but it's pretty bad in how they do it. So
I'd be surprised if that doesn't come back again because of how much of like a network favorite that was.
oh, and also the nostalgia thing. I mean, that's what this whole this whole Nicktoons crossover thing is. Just yet another step in the misguided chase after nostalgia, and it's not.
I mean, is Klasky's Supo even like
Klasky
extant?
Chupo? I don't think they really exist anymore in any way, shape, or form, as far as I'm aware of. I think they're gone at this point.
Apparently, they resurrected the company in 2012.
Hmm.
That was also like 4 years ago, so means nothing at this
Doesn't
point, I guess.
I mean I haven't seen any of their productions on TV that I can think of.
Nope.
I mean,
They apparently started working on some shorts or something.
well, and that's what it is hoping that they'll get another shot at a TV series. But the problem is if it's Nickelodeon and they offer you the TV series, well, you don't know whether or not they're going to just throw your show into like the back end of the scheduling nightmare, or if they'll advertise it at all. Some of these cases, they don't advertise the show at all, and they're surprised that no one has gone to go see it.
Mm-hmm.
So it's just incompetence, not on an artistic level from the artists. It's incompetence on the higher level, and I think there's also just a lack of vision of what they want. A lot of these decisions and the way stuff that they're green lighting and things like that, it feels old hat. It feels like something that you would have seen 10 or 15 years ago being done. Like it doesn't feel like it had the decision making process and the tastes in the people who they're selecting have really changed all that much. At least it just feels that way.
Yeah.
I mean, I think them not picking up Adventure Time was like their first like what the.
I mean, to be fair, like at the first start, like who knew that Adventure Time was going to be as nearly as nutso as it was? Like,
I mean, especially since it doesn't resemble that original pilot at all.
Well,
when you get down
the
to it.
Robiana kind of did.
It kind
A
of
little
did
bit,
on
but
some,
that's it.
but here's the thing: is like I remember when they first did they did a huge panel about their these shorts programs way back when I used to go to San Diego Comic-Con, and this was before they aired on TV. And I first saw that pilot, I immediately knew what it was going to be, and so I was waiting for like the 5-year period for someone to actually pick it up. So like even a layperson, I think, was able to recognize that something was interesting going on with it.
Sure.
It's
Though
just that
interesting doesn't mean it'll
let. Yeah.
Interesting doesn't necessarily mean that it'll be a success, though. Like there's plenty of interesting ideas out there that have been abysmal failures. I mean, kind of the history of most anime to some degree. It's like, oh yeah, this seems like a good concept, and then you see actually what they do, and it's like, oh.
Well,
no.
yes, that's true, but that's the idea of what you do when you take risks and get a success. The problem is that I think Nickelodeon has decided we're not going to take risks anymore, so we're just going to keep on trying to pump out the same thing, and then ask for all our new programs to fit that model that we have preconceived as being safe. And that's
They
why
seem
their
to,
stuff has just been abysmally boring to me.
they seem to just hope that they eventually a new SpongeBob will just magically appear in their hands with like all the time it took for necessarily even like something like SpongeBob to become insanely popular. Like it's not like SpongeBob like immediately the second the first episode aired was insanely popular. Like it was.
Nope.
Well, none of the shows, even on Cartoon Network, were like immediate successes the first two episodes. It took,
Absolutely not.
but here's the thing: Cartoon Network was willing to stand behind them, and also the way they cultivated their talent and supported the talent, artistically and managerially, is so much different.
Cartoon Network seems to be cognizant of the fact that okay, we're building a brand, we're looking at long-term profit, not necessarily short-term returns. Like expecting short-term returns is nearsighted, or expecting things to necessarily fall within these same traditional trends is a pointless. Like they're not, Cartoon Network is not trying to make a new Toonami every day or something. They're not looking just constantly to recreate past successes, and in fact almost everything that they're airing now is so diametrically different than the things that they used to air a decade ago.
Yeah, well, they
or
understood.
like 2 decades ago.
They understood that tastes change. There was this recent post I've been seeing, making the rounds where it's it's an animated GIF of the head shapes of various modern character designs you've seen both on like Disney and Cartoon Network and things like that, kind of morphing into each other, and they all have a very similar kind of like a jelly bean head shape, and then the mouth has the same shape, and the eyes are generally similarly proportioned. And I think a lot of people took that the wrong way in thinking that, this type of stylistic thing is a intentional, cynical choice amongst artists to copy each other rather than a natural evolution of influences and just a cultural diet of artists growing up. And the thing is over 10, 15 years, that stuff, the art form and what people are interested in seeing evolves. And when you have executives who are unwilling or unable to see that change happens and that it's organic, you get people just you get these really dumb ideas that just feel desperate. The "hello, fellow children," that kind of thing. Oh no, is it fellow kids? I think was what it was. Whatever.
Hello, fellow teens.
Yes,
Steve Buscemi, get out of here.
Yes, that's the one. It's like, or the famous Principal Skinner quote. Are they right? Am I that out of touch? No, it's the children that are wrong. Like that's what it feels like when I'm watching Nickelodeon in their decision-making process, at least.
Hello, fellow teenagers. Let us go to the colossal pillar of wasp eggs. Let's go. Do not bring weapons.
Why aren't kids liking this? It's their fault.
Not enough wasp eggs.
Yes.
Sorry. That's how it works.
Whenever SpongeBob's not around, everyone should be asking, where's SpongeBob?
We gotta find SpongeBob.
We gotta
find SpongeBob!
Why? That's actually a good question. Why haven't they gone to that guy and got him a TV show?
That's a good
when
question.
You say
Why
that guy,
isn't Great the Show on Cartoon Network?
Don't know. I mean, they already have quite a bit of investment in the properties they're already working on, so, I think they're doing fine as is. They have so much talent in the studio already. I mean, it's almost, I think it's like, I don't want to say the phrase embarrassment of riches. It's just that they have, because it's not an embarrassment. They just have so many talented people in there working on other shows who are now working on pilots in the background for Cartoon Network. So
to some degree, they don't need to bring in additional staff because they got the staff. They got dudes.
Yeah, but at the same time,
that is also,
it is good to bring in new people, but by cultivating them, it just helps a lot. Making an artist feel like they're supported in the decision making. It's really nice to have that, as opposed to feeling like you have to defend your choices from nonsensical corporate notes at every given moment. Right. Like, can you imagine?
That is an excellent point, but I kind of don't think that it was a really. Ukinojo is probably all right where he is.
Yeah. I mean, I have a whole bunch of complaints about the YouTube model of how they compensate artists, but that's, I think, a conversation for another day.
Sure.
But
I think he gets most of his money through Patreon anyway.
yeah, well, that's one of those things that kind of feeds into the overall critique of YouTube being insufficient for that. But
Mhm.
either way, I guess my major point would be: could you imagine a show like Steven Universe being able to exist on a network like Nickelodeon?
No.
I mean, just yeah, and that's exactly it. It's
Maybe 10 years ago, but not now.
no, I know. I would say not
absolutely
even
not.
10 years ago. I mean, looking at the themes that it has done, and having
Oh, well,
the
yeah,
female
okay.
characters and all sorts of stuff like that. Like no, like typical executive thinking would go, well, that's just controversial. We're not gonna do that.
Well, I mean,
That's
I honestly I would have said the same thing, 10 years ago about like Avatar for that matter. Like, why did Avatar all of a sudden show up on that network?
That's what I was getting at. Yeah, like about 10 years ago, they seemed at least slightly more trusting and like willing to give more free reign to those creators. But I mean, today, absolutely not. It would not happen at all.
well, I think Avatar for them was just like a lucky slip up, in a system that's kind of
Mhm.
designed to take good ideas and kill them and just bring the bland ones out. I think what happened was is Avatar ended up being a fluke that somehow escaped that assembly line process and
Fair
just
enough.
it turned out good. I think it's a fluke rather than a I think it's the exception that proves the rule.
Mhm.
There's plenty of times in U.S. television history in general where, a show that was considered, oh, it's not going to be the successful turns out to be successful, despite how people were thinking. So, like Cheers, for example, its first season did really terrible in the ratings, but the people who were doing the producing behind it trusted in it enough to give it more time, and it became successful. There's just not a lot of willingness or the ability to see, is there something inside there that's worth saving, or can we salvage it and things like that. I mean, I think it's just a lack of just creative ability on the executive side. I think executives need to have a good sense of aesthetics and art. They don't have to be artists themselves, but I think they have to understand taste. They have to understand what they're seeing in order to make these good decisions, and I think a lot of them just aren't at the moment.
Mhm.
So anyway, I think we spent a good amount of time on that. So let's go to today's topic, which is Ghost in the Shell standalone complex. This we're covering only the first season, and this was the one that aired, I think, originally in 2002 through 2003.
Yep.
And it's so surprising to me when I look at it because I think of it as not being that long ago, and also just aesthetically, it ages really well. I mean, it's still in a lot of ways it still looks fantastic in a way that a lot of shows back then don't hold up. I mean,
It's amazing how much better it does CG in animation than CG in animation does now.
sometimes
Like
there are cases
I
there
think it still does better for most.
for the most part in certain places it does feel awkward, but I think that's just a technological thing. But it's there's no supreme errors in the CG that bring you out of it. I would say I think the intro has some problems, not in
Oh, well,
terms
the
of
intro doesn't count in this case.
well,
Come on.
it's well directed CG. But having her face being rendered the way it is with the itty bitty baby teeth inside the baby mouth and CG just was not.
I mean, the
Not a good
opening I
choice.
think it's easy to ignore because it's like a completely different style from the series itself.
Oh yes, of
Feels more
course.
it's like feels more like an art film someone did, and they're like, sure, let's
Yeah.
use it.
I mean,
yeah,
it's
and
well
that
directed.
was definitely-
It's just that the modeling of the face is just everything
That
else
was-
kind of looks really cool.
That was absolutely definitely technical constraints because it looks basically what a game would look like on the PS2, which was the system that was around during the time that this show came
Oh
out.
yeah, exactly.
It's definitely like the ability that they could do with 3D models at the time. That was the best that they could really do before they figure out.
The one thing I
how to
will
make
say
3D models
that
look good.
I'm really glad that has gotten better is CG crowds and walkers. When I watch some of the crowd scenes when they do the CG people running up to cars, crowding around the cars, I go, okay, they've gotten a lot better at those.
I see. I don't know. Well, the thing is that they usually are pretty good about like when they do that in here. They don't do it very often, and it tends to be very far away. Like they
Oh yeah,
what-
I mean,
the one
it's
thing
just,
about this is
but
that production IG.
I'm more eagle-eyed than most people, so I can recognize where I've seen
I
improvements.
catch where it happens a lot of the time, but at the same time, as I notice, like, oh, like the thing about production IG with this is that they are very intelligent about how they're doing it.
Yes.
In the sense that everybody is far the fuck away, or the color schemes are such that they basically kind of cover up the fact. Like,
Yes.
and that's the most interesting thing, and one of the great things. Like, okay, 3D CG is handled so terribly when it's used with 2D animation, almost always. And the way they get away with it on this one by having major characters be essentially 3D CG, like, the Tachikomas are walking tanks.
They're
And they're
robots. It works really well when you have a CG as a robot.
Well, the thing is, no, usually it doesn't, though, because so often the issue is that either the palette doesn't work well, where it looks just fake when you have it overlaid over the 2D, 4 view, or the issue is that the frame rate is completely off.
Yes.
Where, either the frame rate is, moving at a different, sort of rate,
well, it's
slightly.
one's smoother than the rest of the animation.
Yeah, either one's too smooth, or, like, they're offset at a slightly different angle. Like, okay, the gaps don't line up, or, like, okay, like, the overall animation itself, say, is, like, 60 frames. Like, like, the top-level film reel itself is 60 frames. And then the animation in it is, like, say, 25 frames. But the CG could be at 25 frames, but it could be offset from the actual 2D itself. So it's like moving when everything is not moving, which just gives this really subtle feeling of, oh, gross. Like,
it doesn't belong. Yeah.
It's like it's moving through reality in the wrong way. And you'd think like robots in vehicles would be easy to do well. The thing is, fundamentally, they don't. Like mecha series, which are very reliant on, we've got cool robots, kind of look like garbage when they have the lead mecha be done in 3D CG because it just feels wrong. The frame rate is just not. It just doesn't work well.
Well, and the animation usually isn't that great. Versus here, when you see the Tachikomas move, the way they have weight, the way they feel like they're grounded, they don't. The way the timing of the movement is a lot better than a lot of mecha animation, where the mechas just move kind of slowly and somewhat robot-like, but they're still floaty. These characters don't float in the same way that a lot of bad CG and 2D mixtures can sometimes have. And again, like I think there has been a lot of really great improvements lately in the use of CG in a lot of anime. I think they've done some really great stuff on how to do tracking shots, certain environmental things, camera, special effects. But when it comes to character animation, it struggles a lot. And this is something that is still fairly impressive. The Tachikoma animation in CG
it helps
It
helps that the Tachikomas are also like geometrically extremely simple.
Yeah.
They're mostly just a bunch of spheres with a couple of extra bits on them. So they obviously were not particularly hard to model and animate. It was just that they had to make them work in the the rest of the entire series at 2D, and they figured out like an extremely good shader that would work with it, and they figured out the animation to work perfectly. Pretty much.
It's just very strong, I think, intelligent production design, and I think that was. And when I say production design, I don't mean just in terms of just aesthetics, but also how they planned it out, how they came up with their workflow, how to integrate all these things. They thought about that very intelligently, and they pulled it off. There are only occasional times where I go, okay, that face is drawn really poorly, but that happens in, it's television. They have a horrible schedule that they have to keep up, so I don't blame them for that.
The weird thing with that, though, to me, is the fact that the character that tends to have the worst face consistently is the major.
Yes, that's what I was about to say.
Who the main character should be. And I've always been kind of wondering if that's actually secretly deliberate. Like okay, hear me out here. She is the one with
the simplest face.
She has the simplest face, but she's also the one with the fakest, like in universe, like the most cybernetic. She's got a fake ass face. So
well, her entire body is.
Yeah, exactly. And she's got more cybernetics than basically everybody on the team. And most people, period. So I've always been wondering, as a theory, like, what if she's deliberately meant to look a little off occasionally when you look at her? So you go like, oh yeah, she's fake. Her body is fake. And they even call attention that her body is like, doesn't have like a particularly well like sculpted like custom like physical design or anything, in terms of appearance. She's kind of got like a generic model in terms of appearance is what they kind of say, even at the end of like Standalone Complex. So like.
Well, I think the other thing, too, is that the other faces, and mostly the male faces, are so well structured. They feel very geometric. when you have a face with a certain level of detail and structure, it's a lot easier when you're drawing it to place the features and do measurements. When you have a face that is kind of devoid of indicators of form, it's a lot more difficult to have the consistency. And I think, and you'll see this in a lot of the stuff where male characters will get a lot of variation and a lot of detail and a lot of variation in their structure, whereas female characters will just go like, oh, here's our female model, we'll change the hair and eyes a little bit, and that's it. Like, and I think that might be the issue here in that regard, because just the difference between them is so high. But then again, plenty of the other female characters look fine.
Yeah, that's why I've always wondered if like it was like
she's supposed to be
deliberate.
doll-like.
Yeah, exactly. Where it's always like a little uncanny at times. Like, is that the same face she had last? It's kind of the sense of like what's going on there.
But I'm talking more about like the eyes are not looking in the right directions.
Sure.
That's what I'm talking about. Is every once in a while I'll go like, oh, that's her nose is slid across her. That mouth is not. That doesn't make any sense. That happens, but that happens in all television animation, just because. Like the scheduling, it just happens. But in general, production IG doesn't do Studio Dean level, disasters in that regard by any means. It's just funny. I think it's only funny to me when I see it because it's such an exception for them.
Yep.
Because their standard of quality is so high and everything else about it is so cinematic. I think this was one of the first ones I've seen in a long time. When it first came out on when I remember when it was first broadcasting on Adult Swim, I was like, God damn! It feels like a movie.
Yep.
And that's
everything aside, and like animation aside, Senlon Complex is a damn good police procedural TV show.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's like it almost
like
feels
ignoring,
like it could have not been anime to some degree.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think they have a good reason for it to be animated, just because the world that they've created. Which I kind of want to get into a little bit later, just because my one downside with the series. So going from the visuals aside, just the visuals, I think it's really hard to attack the show on that, just because the camera work, the compositions, animation, it's top notch. It's production IG at some of their best. And again, this is back in 2002 when a lot of this new digital technology was just starting to really get entered into the process. So that's even more impressive because of that, because during that transitional period, it was painful for a lot of studios to be able to do that, and they handled it surprisingly well. But my big problem with the series is not. I think it's that there's a lot of stuff going on philosophically and politically, and just also the history of the world that these characters inhabit is so complex. That it often, I find myself having to stop and then rewind and make sure I hear things right, and it can get a bit fast paced for me. I also watched the dubbed version, which might have its own complicated aspects, and
it is easier to follow in the sub version.
Yeah,
to certain degrees, a little bit of that's just because reading it kind of makes it land, and especially if hearing these, Japanese politician names and Japanese corporation names, it can be a bit hard, even the dub version. Even if you have a lot of familiarity with that sort of stuff, even intermixed with the dubbed English voice acting and some, early on also like the dub is a pretty good dub.
Yeah, I was about to say it's not that the dub is bad. It's just that the show hands the dub actors a really heavy job to do. They have a limited amount of mouth movements in which they're able to speak, and then they have to also talk about some of these really complex subjects in that short amount of time with the metonymy that the original animation had provided them.
Yeah, so it adds so many more constraints on conveying the script.
Because in terms of acting wise, it's like some of my favorite actors are doing that. You have some really strong performances. It's just that I think they are hamstrung a little bit by the script writing and just the amount of time they're given to say some of their lines.
I'd say it's less even hamstrung by the script writing, more just hamstrung by the nature of animation dubbing. In the sense, it's not like they can relocalize it or add, stuff in to pad it. Like, if this was a stage play, for example, you can take a different approach, to draw it out. Each stage play, the performers do their own things to alter how the play is fundamentally told. To make sense to their audience and the people performing it. And they obviously don't have that capability here because that's the nature of dubs. You have to work with what they got. And with something as complex as this, that is something that they can't really do. I personally, I absolutely love the actual script and story of Ghost in the Shell standalone complex. I think it's great. I love the things that they actually do with that world. I like how absolutely fucked everything is, but it's beneath like a veneer of like normalcy. It's like the most subtly nihilistic like thing imaginable. Like from a political standpoint, it's so cynical. Like
it's dystopic as fuck.
It's dystopic, but it's also basically saying like, this dystopia. It's not that much different from nowadays, now is it, huh? We got cyborgs and shit, but the dystopia is the politicians.
Yeah, it's naturalistic in its dystopia. It's not like the young adult novels, these days, where it's a believable, recognizable society, even with the sci-fi elements that they put in. And and when I say like the problem with the script writing, it's not that I think that the script writing is bad. It's just that it's complex and it's a big mouthful, and it requires a lot of careful wording in order to convey everything. And then you have that translation from Japanese to English, and how much information you can pack into a short Japanese sentence versus English. It's just a lot harder. It's not that the script is bad by any means. It's just that because of how dense it is, trying to get the timing out right in terms of acting it out in English is just a much harder job, if that makes any sense.
Yeah.
That makes plenty of sense, honestly.
I mean, the one thing I would also say, though, is that it's the fact that this work is very much a show don't tell a lot of the times, does also make it much harder to comprehend going in the first time, because there's a lot of shit where they just don't explain at all about the world. Like, they'll eventually do it, like, occasionally, but, like, they don't go into, like, the whole thing of, like, oh, yeah, what's the deal with the Laughing Man? Until, like, later on they kind of go back, like, oh, yeah, let's explain what this initial situation is, because otherwise we're just going to be talking about it like you know.
Well, they also, that was the other thing, too, is how they kept on, they would go to Laughing Man, and then there would be a whole bunch of episodes that weren't about it, and then they'd go back into the Laughing Man again, then they could do a whole bunch of unrelated episodes, then the Laughing Man again. It was kind of weird.
I like that. I like that they have the balance of the standalone, good cyberpunky episodes, because there's some good shit in there.
I love the standalone episodes, but I think it's just the way they paced it out by, the way they did that was a little bit awkward, but it's not fatal by any means. It was just kind of weird to go, here's a bunch of individual episodes that are singular, which I love, and I love many of the singular episodes. It's just, it feels like a little bit of an interruption. So I ended up getting a little bit lost sometimes, just because I was like, I had kind of forgotten a couple things when we came back to it. Mm-hmm. If that makes any sense, again. So it's
yeah, I follow what you're saying, but personally, I didn't have that experience just because, like, I like the way that it conveyed, like, a passage of time, and, like, the fact that, okay, this isn't all happening at once. It gives you kind of a more broader feel for, like, what it's like to be, this police, cyberpunk unit, essentially.
Yeah,
in the sense, like,
Section 9, the way Section 9 feels from a day-to-day operation standpoint. And again, like, it's a completely valid tactic. Mm-hmm. I just think because the intrigue and conspiracy behind the Laughing Man story is relatively complex, that it just suffers a little bit just because it has so much it wants to tell, and there's a lot of threads that interrupting it with a bunch of episodes that, again, while good, are disconnected.
So, that's a totally fair criticism of it, and they agree with you to some respect, because they did re-release the entire first season as a series of OVAs. It was just the Laughing Man. Yeah. Just like parts.
Oh, okay. I mean, because I love the individual episodes themselves. They're just like...
Part of it was, I'm willing to bet, they had, the story to tell, but honestly, if you tried to tell the Laughing Man story over a series of 26 episodes, it would have got... They obviously could have injected more, but
what they could have done
obviously would have gotten dry at some point.
Is just do a lot of these, the unconnected stories, and then do the Laughing Man thing as a finale. So the latter half of the series is just the Laughing Man.
Yeah, but then you wouldn't have the hook of the main story arc of the show until the very end. Like, they don't even introduce the Laughing Man until the 4th episode.
Yeah.
And also the whole fact, like, a lot of the actual stuff that happens with the Laughing Man situation, it's both about the Laughing Man mystery, but it's also about, hey, the government's cracking down on the shit Section 9's been up to. And that kind of requires all the shit that happened before to some degree. And also the fact that there is a very, real, like, emotional undercurrent of, like, these characters that go into that final resolution in the sense of, like, how they act and the things that happen to them. Because shit goes to fucking hell in those last couple episodes.
Oh,
last
yeah.
3 episodes where things go down, and it's, like, without, like, the emotional buildup, like, some of these characters and some of these, character-specific episodes, like, I mean... Would you, if you'd gone straight to, just the, just the Laughing Man stuff, like, would you, like, this Tachikoma stuff at the end, would that have been nearly as emotional or, effective? Like, I don't think so. Or, would you necessarily make sense why Bato is acting like a weirdo at times in the sense of, like, it's not Bato just being, a jerk just because this is just how Bato is. He's a kind of a sentimental goof.
Well, no, I mean, I say that having the standalone episodes standalone is a completely valid. It's a valid strategy, both in terms of just artistic and telling a story and having that emotional resonance. The issue I only had is because of the inherent complicated nature of the Laughing Man story itself. I mean, I think it's unique to just the style of that conspiracy thing. It just becomes a little bit difficult to follow. But emotionally, yes, I completely agree with you on the emotional level, and that's why this confusion is not a fatal flaw by any means.
Right.
It is merely just like God, there's just so many different names and organizations, and just it's like, God damn it, and then having to remember and go back and forth between it just sometimes got a little bit more annoying. But it emotionally, all the beats and the pacing of it was perfectly fine. It made perfect sense.
It's probably particularly worse too when it was first airing, when it was obviously done weekly.
Oh, yeah, I mean, and not being able to pause immediately, do like scrub back a few minutes just to rehear it. That was when I remember when I was first watching it on Adult Swim. Sometimes I was like, I love this, but I need to have it slow the fuck down so I can understand who these organizations and cabinet ministers are that they're referencing to each. It's like, damn it.
Man, sure, half of those words were fantastic. I'll get back to you on the other half.
Yeah, I mean, and here's the other thing too, is like the hard part is because a lot of these major historical events that they kind of reference, like, I guess there was a Third World War.
There was a Fourth World War.
A Fourth
they
World
talk
War.
about World War
nuclear,
IV,
where everybody got nuked.
And then the America is now a full-on in
Empire,
words empire. Right?
There's There's 3 different Americas, though. That's the thing. There's the basically the United States is a rump state that's like just fucking like North Dakota basically, and then they've got a Russian aligned like one on like the California side, and then you have the American Empire, which is the Confederacy, which is hilarious.
Oh my god!
And it's basically they only interact with the American Empire because they're the ones that's doing all the
shady
U.S.
shit.
imperialist shady shit.
Literally, it's imperialist. I mean,
yeah.
it's not very subtle, but I mean, but sometimes that stuff gets really confusing because these characters are. I mean, again, I don't like it when a show has to pull all the stops and go like, okay, this is what happens. Is it really weird that we have to say this expository dialogue to each other because we live in this universe and that's just how it works? But at the same time, because they reference some of these events and political statuses so much that it does get confusing at times.
See,
but at the same time, I agree with keeping it vague and not over-explaining it. It's just that in a whirlwind of terminology and tech terms and neologisms and all this, I mean, it just sometimes gets a bit much when you're just trying to take it in at face value sometimes.
It has limitations.
The extra worst thing about it, though, is that I find most of it super interesting and there isn't that much information on it.
Yeah, that's the other question, too, is like, one of the big things I was trying to figure out throughout the series.
Why is Imperial America actually on really good terms with Japan as it is in the show? They're honestly really good terms if they're working together the way that they do.
Kind of, but at the same time,
I mean, working
really
together in quotes, but they're both corporate.
They're also both fucking over each other constantly, but they're also working with each other. So.
Well, that's kind of that's actually pretty realistic in how things do play out in real life. you have a lot of international agreements, but then underneath it, you have people spying on allies, and that's not the unusual part. Um, it's just in general, like we're being introduced to this world that seems both realistic and recognizable, but at the same time is also what the fuck insane. They have like a big refugee crisis, and they constantly, they reference these refugees, but I don't know who exactly these refugees are, where they come from, and it just, again, I don't. At the same time, though, I don't want them to explain it, because then it will be really awkward and expository, and it's weird. It's one of those things where I don't have a good answer for how to fix the problem. It's just that I think it's mostly only it only becomes a problem because we're also dealing with so much other terminology that it's throwing at us to begin with.
Yeah.
Like if that was on its own, and I could easily understand other stuff, like all these weird syndromes and other, again, neologisms and terminology they made up for the technology and how things are functioning, it would be fine if I didn't also have to figure that shit out too.
An interesting thing about like always going for sci-fi and cyberpunk stuff in particular is that so much of it is building an interesting world, then like implications of how things work that maybe you could logic out by using all the information you have available to you, but then never actually going into it, because the possibility space is actually more interesting than actually going into it, and exhausting it.
Yeah.
There's a interview from like 1986 with William Gibson, where he's talking about how Escape from New York influenced some of his writing for Neuromancer, like the first big, cyberpunk work. And they're talking about how there's an opening line in the beginning of Escape from New York where Snake Plissken is asked, "You flew the Wing 5 over Leningrad, didn't you?" And basically it's kind of this thing of they don't explain it all at the time. They don't explain at all what the hell that means from a situation. But there's ways you can kind of infer, like, oh, he flew like a glider over Leningrad. Like, what does that mean in terms of the world? Like, what's the situation between the United States and like Russia here? Why would someone do that sort of thing? None of it's at all gone over. But it's a good example of how sci-fi works best, where a sort of casual reference in a scene can imply an awful lot about the state of the world.
Yes.
And also give a lot of building off points that potentially could be touched on, but not necessarily. As it turned out in Escape from New York, that actually is touched on almost immediately because they do a glider entry into New York.
Yeah.
But, it's not, often the case, it's not like a lot of the Imperial America stuff, like, it ends up being more important because of the second season than in anything in the first season. In the first season, it's just a kind of offhand thing, like, okay, the United States, okay, or, the Imperial American Empire, occasionally fucks with Section 9 and works with Section 9, and Section 9 occasionally takes advantage of, things and assets that, the American Empire
they did.
owes
They,
them.
they in Laughing Man, they directly do shit with the CIA's network.
Yeah, they basically
times.
borrow it and basically
a global
say, like,
satellite observation network that apparently they keep track of like everything on the world.
The NSA, essentially.
yeah, basically,
Yeah,
it's
the
like,
NSA, but
they
more
basically
obvious.
said, "Yeah, we'll get it on loan. Like, we'll fill out the paperwork to get it. They owe us at this point, given that they were."
Oh no, they
fucking
don't
with
even
us
do
early
that. They
episodes.
literally go like, "Wait a minute, did we just somehow get inside this net?" Like they were kind of surprised they got into it, but they knew it. It's like this thing that supposedly officially is not supposed to exist.
Well, no, with that one they actually got permission for it because they basically said
Right.
the paperwork. They went through it. The thing that they went like accidentally was when they actually they had the whole thing with the CIA guys supervising them.
Yes.
And then they hacked their network while they're doing it to confront them about the shit that they were basically manipulating them.
Yeah.
Two separate situations. The whole downloading things for the Laughing Man was later on, basically, and it was because of that earlier shit saying like, oh yeah, they owe us at this point, given that earlier bullshit.
Yeah. But you see, like, I definitely I agree with what you're saying in that, like, making these hints at the greater world can kind of help as great flavor text. But the problem is you can also become it can go overboard pretty easily and become confusing, and it's a very difficult line to walk, especially because the series, I think, has a lot of ambition, both philosophically and I think in terms of examining. Maybe not politics, and because like a lot of, I mean, a lot of it's situations that we don't recognize exactly because none of the parties that we normally recognize are in play, but it's more like a sociological thing. So it's like philosophical and sociological analysis. So like it's kind of hard to
And it certainly gets it's. I would certainly agree with you that it definitely gets very difficult when it goes into the sort of deep
nitty gritty.
philosophical, like nitty gritty, like particularly in the end where the second they start talking about vanishing mediators, you kind of have to sit there and pause and think like, what the hell are they going on about?
Well,
I
I'm
mean,
thinking about also just like the cabinet ministers and the all. I mean that type of politicking. I
sure,
mean,
and
I
that's that.
appreciate how realistically they handle it and how it is realistically complex, like in real life. But I'm also watching an entertainment medium where I've also been bombarded with so much other like shit I had to.
And
It
I'm sure that
just
stuff is easier if you actually, live in Japan and have a good
oh
familiarity
probably
with how their Politburo works, essentially, in terms of all the different cabinet stuff and the sort of election cycle and whatnot. And I would expect that, if we did the equivalent with, all of our Congress and all the different, subcommittees
oh
and
it would be
committees
confusing as
and,
fuck
yeah,
and the thing is and I
SARS.
appreciate again
Yep.
that level of thought and detail that's put into it, but at the same time I go, oh god, it's another thing I have to keep track of in my
It's
head.
overwhelming.
it
It
it,
is
it
absolutely overwhelming,
yeah,
especially
I
on the
think,
first
and
watch.
I think that's what it is that it that's my only real criticism of it is that it's overwhelming. I appreciate though at the same time how much thought is put into it and how fleshed out they really have done this world. Even if they don't go into detail of it, you still feel all those little pieces being influenced in
Right.
there.
It's also lends a lot to making the show eminently rewatchable.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It is a very rewatchable show. Like, I did not feel bad about watching this show 3 times over the past 2 years.
I
I mean,
mean, you kind of almost have to because they lay a lot of small little details that build up. So again, like
Mhm.
even in some of those standalone episodes, you start noticing little things that kind of pick up and keep going through later.
well, another thing I'd say for like the standalone episodes, like the very fact that this show is essentially the way I would describe it, it's like it's a police procedural, but it's not. It's kind of like a police anti-procedural in a way, given the fact that they are constantly breaking the rules and their laws, like they're just bending the
Mhm.
rules on based off their own like sort of code and shit. Like it's the fact that it is kind of that sort of format lends well to rewatching, just because you have all these so differently disparate like sort of adventures happening, and there's very often very little in terms of commonality between them, which makes rewatching very good and easy. It's kind of like how that works for like if you catch a Law and Order rerun. If it's one you've seen before, that's not necessarily a bad thing because so many of those episodes are so different from each other that it's kind of like, oh yeah, this I've not maybe never seen this type of storyline again, since then or before then. So yeah, sure, why not? And it's certainly with Ghost in the Shell, standalone complex, that the fact that it is a cyberpunk police procedural makes it so unique, and then your standalone episodic episodes just really hold up really well as something you could just watch again and again because they don't repeat themselves.
It doesn't follow a formula, I think, is what it is. I mean, each standalone episode has a different philosophy or an idea or an emotional journey,
Mhm.
and the way they pace it out, they don't have murder, investigation, it doesn't follow the typical, as you were saying, like a police procedural dramatic writing structure. It doesn't do that. It tells the stories in a more humanistic way, and that keeps them a lot more interesting than they would be if you followed, the genre as is.
Yeah.
Mhm.
So let's talk about some of the characters. I think it's really interesting what they do. I feel that the character of oh god, I'm trying to remember the names now. The one with the mullet. Why can't I remember his name?
Hokusa.
Hokusa.
Tokusa.
Yeah.
That fucking mullet. I get why the character.
Look,
Yeah, I mean,
Ghost in the Shell was originally made in like what, this like late 70s?
well that and
80s.
also
It was the
80s.
late 80s.
well that and
kinda.
also
Okay.
apparently the designer was like, I kind of wanted to have more of a lion feeling to him, and I go like, I see where that is, but they should have pushed it a little bit further so it wasn't a mullet and just let the hair be a little bit longer, and that would work.
Mhm.
As is, it's just like, oh, that's stupid hair. But besides that, I think he's kind of like the entry point character for a lot of people because he is the one with the least amount of cybernetics, and he actually has to deal with things like dying from wounds and things like that.
And he's also a former cop, and we all have some sort of frame of reference of how a cop would do.
And
normally.
he also has a family, because nobody else... He's the only one who has a family, which they point out multiple times.
This isn't actually in the show, I'm pretty sure, but in the first movie, they even like literally say, "We hired you because you have a different point of view from the rest of us. You're just kind of a normal ass dude."
They do actually say
all
that
of
in
us
Standalone Complex. I think they actually say that at one point, like where they were talking about like, oh, the whole point of here is not for you to be doing the same thing that we can do. Or,
physically, he's also a better investigator than a lot of them too.
Yeah, he has actually the best he is an actual detective. He's the best investigator on the team, straight up.
Well,
but it's
the major is a little bit in that she could do everything. Like that's the one thing with her is that she is so good at pretty much everything that she sometimes ends up being boring, even though other parts of her are really dynamic. If that makes sense.
More that the rest of Section 9 is just people who are better at one thing than she is, and she's better at everything else.
Yeah. But she's almost better than every single individual is at their individual thing, though.
I mean,
sometimes it feels a bit much. I mean, I love her character, and I mean, it's just every once in a while I go, she's almost too good at everything.
Yeah, I think it's better to say that Togusa is not necessarily a better investigator than her, but he thinks outside the box better than she does.
They often have Togusa come to conclusions that nobody else does, and the other thing with like Togusa is that he's often the kind of he's kind of a more emotionally grounded, and he's less into like some of the cyberpunk stuff going on. He's often a bit more not necessarily cynical, but more skeptical of it all.
Yeah.
Whereas it's kind of interesting. Whereas a lot of the other characters kind of take it for granted and just kind of go with it regardless.
Mm-hmm.
Well, that's what I mean by him as being as the entry point. Is he is the closest to the audience in terms of his perspective on the situation. He's an outsider to this group, but at the same time, he is a part of that group. So we're also not alienated.
Yeah, I think he's the audience jumping point, but I don't think he's necessarily the audience surrogate.
No, that's exactly it.
Because the audience surrogate is clearly Bato.
Yeah,
I think so. I'd agree with that. That's why I said entry point. I made sure not to say surrogate.
Sure, you are right. Yeah, but I just wanted to call attention to that separation there because there is a very clear separation there.
Yeah. So let's get into Bato then, because he seems to be a very popular character.
Bato is more or less the real main character of the show when you get down to it.
Yeah, as a thought experiment, I actually ran a quick poll on Twitter. I got like a couple hundred people voting on it to say like who their favorite character from Public Security Section 9 was in Standalone Complex. Tachikoma was excluded because that's a little cheap.
Yeah.
So Bato was in the clear lead. The major ended up falling shortly a little bit behind, and then a little bit behind that was Togusa. And after that, there's kind of a big drop to Aramaki, and then Ishikawa, Saito. And then there's another big drop to go to Pazu, and of course, Borma running up the tail end.
He got 2 votes, and I'm pretty sure both of them were jokes.
I mean...
It's a shame, because I love his pachinko parlor thing. That's just
that's
great.
Ishikawa.
That's Ishikawa.
That's Ishikawa.
I thought that was Ishikawa. Yeah. I thought that was Bulma. Okay.
No, that's Ishikawa.
Nope.
Borma is the second Bato, the one with the red things. He's the demolition.
Okay.
He's the one who only really gets stuff during second gig, and it's also not all that much.
It's like a quarter of an episode.
I don't know why, but I confuse. I don't know why I confuse the names, but yeah, okay. Ishikawa's awesome though.
Ishikawa's great. Like the thing is about almost all the characters ends up getting through both the seasons gets their own sort of episode for them. It's just that Borma somehow just gets the drop that doesn't get an episode at all.
Yeah. Ishikawa doesn't either, technically.
Sure.
But
he does a lot. He does a lot more throughout, and a lot more. Again, the pachinko parlor thing of using the old man brains as a cloud computer was really funny to me.
Ishikawa is also the guy who tends to explain stuff more, so he's just kind of like often just there.
Well, he's the techie.
Narration.
Yeah, he appears much more often than he's like the 5th most prominent Section 9 character.
Yeah,
which is. That aside, he's still not technically an important character to the plot of the show. He's just
he's
just the one who appears more often.
I think.
Yeah, he is absolutely.
Yeah. So
character-wise, he doesn't actually have that much going for him aside from being a couple of really good character moments.
Yeah.
But Bato is like he's so crucial to how this show works because he's sort of the audience surrogate in the sense that he's like the soul of the show. Like he's the person who kind of like wears his like soul and like heart on his kind of sleeve to some degree.
Well,
But
he,
he's
he
also
keeps his humanity out in the open. I mean, I think you have him as a contrast to the Major in that her aloofness is kind of a foil for Bato's sincerity.
yeah, Bato's like so sincere and also like he's just so willing to like kind of like whereas like Togusa is like so skeptical of what's going on, like Bato isn't exactly an optimist by any means, but he's also just so willing to kind of embrace like the new form of humanity to some degree. Like
Well,
the
it seems like he kind of has to. I think he's also almost entirely cybernetic too, right?
sure.
Yes. Yeah.
So,
But
but I think the most interesting thing is like the way he like the whole reason that the touch comas get individuality, it basically comes down to the fact that oh yeah, Bato treats them like individuals and like not just tools, and that's basically enough to like kind of give them the starting point for developing their own identity and like sort of like conscience and like full sentience, and that's kind of an interesting reflection of just who Bato is, in the sense that yeah, he would be the guy to do that kind of thing. In the sense like yeah, he's not really gonna get worked up about that kind of stuff, and he's also the one that gets most broken up about the fact when they end up like decommissioning them in this series because he honestly has an emotional connection to things that everybody else are kind of like yeah they're just robots like yeah they're smart and they learn that's kind of dangerous and scary in fact and Bato is just kind of like no well hang out with them kind of things like he doesn't really fret about it that much.
Yep. And like throughout the entire series, they even like go on that he's actually relatively sentimental, like compared to every other character in
yes,
Section 9, basically, aside from Togusa. Because it's like he buys weight training equipment still. He's a cyborg. He literally can't train his muscles or anything like
and then
that. He just
there's
does
the
it because it
food
feels
and
good to him.
yeah.
And yeah, he still eats, well, although it's cyborg food because he can't actually eat like normal food.
Yeah.
Like he is very much attached to his like humanity. He is a person inside of a metal shell, like synthetic shell. Whereas the Major kind of is so mysterious that they never really go into whether or not she is a like real character for a very long time. If you know what I'm talking
yeah,
about.
and with her, like you always have this sort of ambiguity of like what her intentions are and like what she actually cares about, and you also just kind of get this impression that to some degree, she's almost like willing to kind of just throw her humanity away entirely.
Well,
Yes,
she pretty much, or at least she's willing to risk it quite a
yeah,
few times. I think the weight equipment thing and also I think her watch were some really nice little philosophical points about how much of one's body and one's sense of physical self in terms of location really does define who we are as a person and how we view ourselves and things like that. Like, human shapes determine a lot of our psychology. And I think it was interesting is that I think they even outright state like that a lot of the things that his weight training equipment, other things like that, are a way of hanging on to that kind of sense of self, because otherwise they can just change their body so much so that their identity just becomes lost.
and the
Mhm.
other thing that I think is kind of crucial to their differences in characters, in fact, the Major was, became, a cyborg not by will. She lost her body in an accident. They go into that really heavily.
And at a very early age too.
And like as like a young child. So like she had no choice in the matter. Whereas Bato, they seem to imply that he kind of went into this willingly as part of like his career path.
And
This,
much later, because
yeah.
he makes references to things like Marx Brothers movies and things like that, and I'm like, God, he must be a really old man.
No, well, no, he's just like he's. I think that's more him just being a
That's just him being a
goofball.
goof, yeah, and
No,
like
no, I
liking old
understand, but
stuff.
that's even these days, being a young person who would even look that stuff up is kind of rare.
I
I
mean, if
mean,
you're a
he
goof, like
there's a couple
maybe.
of throwaway lines like where he likes vintage cars too and stuff like that,
Yeah,
and it's very clear that he honestly just likes
old stuff.
old like things across the spectrum of time, basically.
Yeah,
He's got a very weird sort of sensibility that kind of fits well, and that's something like he
Mhm.
kind of jives really well with like Togusa, who he's often paired with, in the sense
yeah.
that they
Mhm.
both also have like they're both very sort of human and grounded to certain degrees, and though Togusa is a lot sort of weaker in a lot of senses, he's a smarter guy than Bato is to be sure, but at the same time like he's like Bato has just got this sort of like element to him where he's like willing to be a lot more harsher. And with Bato, we also get a lot of really good episodes devoted entirely to him sort of wrestling with his own sort of identity and like what he is as a person and how he views himself.
Oh
Like there's
yeah, that boxing episode was devastating.
yeah,
Yeah,
and like
that episode's really good.
that's such a that episode in particular is like such a like minor episode in terms of like what the mystery is. It's like the mystery isn't really there at all. Like there's no like, oh,
Oh, it's
did he
not.
do it or did he not do it? Like no, we learned very quickly that he did it, and Bato eventually
Well,
figures out
Bato,
pretty
no,
quick.
well, no, Bato kind of knows it from the beginning. He's just hoping that he kind of hopes that he's wrong. I think he always knew, but he's like, what the fuck, dude? I looked up to you. Like, I really wanted this to not be true, but I kind of knew it was.
The other thing with that episode in particular is like he's both admires the like I forget what the guy's name is, the boxer.
Zaitsev.
Zaitsev. He admires
Yeah.
Zaitsev both as like what he did as a sportsman in the sense of like as a a sort of masculine ideal to a certain degree. Like, 'cause that's just another example of oh yeah, Bato is into weird shit. Like he was really into cyborg boxing. That sounds like a type of thing that Bato would be into. But at the same time, the other appeal is like he sees so much into like what Zaitsev's like normal like after everyday life is, and like what Zaitsev is clearly like depressed and worked up about, and he also gets really pissed about the fact that what Zaitsev is throwing away to make some money or to to live a more daring life or something. It's a good life. It's not necessarily an exciting life or a daring life, but it's like it's a normal life. There's like he's got a wife. He's got what seems like a pretty good situation going on. There's no real reason for him to be involved in like this espionage, and it just pisses Bato off that he's throwing this shit away.
Well, and even more so, it's a life that Bato knows he's never going to be able to have, even if he wanted to.
Because he's such him as a person is so tied to this like skullduggery bullshit now. Like that's who he
Yeah.
is. He is he is Section 9. He and the Major are basically what makes the core of Section 9 to some degree.
Yeah,
And
well,
that's
that
his
also
life.
the cyborg body in terms
Well,
of
Zaitsev
human,
is also heavily cyborg
but
too.
but
we don't know
to
how
be
much. but sure.
completely so in the sense that it might create some issues about how you have human intimacy. I think there's a bunch of interesting things also in that. I think the Major's concept of her own gender is an interesting subject too, because she had lost her body at such an early age. Her concept of her own gender and who she's attracted to and things like that is not really clearly defined.
No, and they don't really. I mean, the only her personal life is like the thing that they touch on like the least in this show.
But they give little hints of it.
They give little hints in the sense that she has her like girlfriends essentially that she hangs out with, and they don't really go into what the relationship is there, but it's implied to be sort of like a casual romantic type thing. But they don't go into it in any detail. They don't spell it out. They just kind of like have like oh, it intersects occasionally with the story in certain times, and there's a few recurring characters there, and they touch on it more heavily in the second season.
Well, there's also that whole thing about like, well, why don't you switch to a male chassis model and things like that,
And to be fair, though, I think that was more just Bato just being a dick.
Oh yeah, it
deliberately.
was. But I thought within that, even though none of the characters are explicitly making a point about it, that the show itself is making a point with that.
Sure.
I thought it was kind of interesting, and in that because I think. When little kids don't have the same concept of gender as they do when they become a teenager and all sorts of things like that. She never went through a lot of those hallmarks. So her concept of that is completely different. So I thought that was kind of interesting. And I mean, also her own sense of identity is so different from everybody else's because I think everybody else went through the cyberization much later in life. So they had established a sense of identity. She never got that chance. So her aloofness and her strange kind of otherworldly, non-humanish characteristics might be attributed to that she never really had a chance to establish the identity before switching to this strange, existentially philosophical existence that is, being able to switch bodies and exist in ethereal states with no problem.
Yeah. I mean, though we do get certain shot, sort of views into like the Major's like what she cares about because she gets pissed off about like
Certain
stuff.
things, yeah.
They just really get her worked up, in the sense of like stuff like people like getting forced or having like medical conditions decided from, like kind of reflects on her own like
Oh yeah,
personal experience. Like
that was a
anything-
great episode.
Anything
too.
that fucks with children gets her like really kind of pissed off because she kind of reflects on the fact like, oh yeah, my background And she's certainly, it's not like she's like moralless or like immoral or amoral even. She's got a very clear moral code, but she's just also like very like I think just kind of in general very aloof, and that kind of plays interesting in the fact that Bato clearly has a thing for her,
Yeah.
and
But
they don't.
he has no way of being able to express it on either side. They just don't have the. I think it's weird. I mean, I think I think there's the situation they are in terms of just being as a part of Section 9 and the dangers and all sorts of other things that is in the way. But there's also just the emotional disconnect between the two. And maybe her. I think she also, because so much of her life is subterfuge, it's really difficult to kind of get to know someone who's like that.
Sure.
I think she intentionally keeps people at a distance from her. So there's a lot of things going into that. But yes, I think you're right in that he very clearly has some kind of attachment to her.
Yeah, and they again, we're not going to talk much about the second season, but in the broader characters, thing, they do go more into that stuff as well, in second gig, and but it's interesting how little they actually do touch on that stuff in this season. It's because it's almost incidental to like what's going on there. Like it's key for like the things that happening, but this isn't like they didn't feel the need to be this like a grand arc that resolves the characters or anything.
It was
it's a
texture.
It's a texture, and it's to some degree it's also feel like it's an exploration in the sense that they're exploring elements and like what that means and what it's like to be, what it's like to have those characteristics and like how these characters would act within this world. And it's not the focus by any means. And I think that's like one of the interesting aspects of Ghost in the Shell standalone complex, particularly when you juxtapose it with the fact that there are like 3 other different versions of Ghost in the Shell.
Yeah,
and they don't nearly
weird.
do that anywhere as well because they're either so drilled down in like one aspect or the other that they just kind of just lose sight of it all. Like the original manga is closer to standalone complex than anything, but it's also got the weirdness of the fact that its creator is kind of a fucking creep.
Yep.
Could you go into that?
Shiro is a huge weirdo.
Yeah, Masamune Shiro is like basically given up making manga right now because he realized he could make more like money off of making like horse porn art books now.
Mm-hmm.
So that's what he's up to. So that's kind of where his
horse porn.
Don't ask what you don't want an answer to, Neeksy.
Okay.
Don't ask. Trust me, it's worse than you think.
So this is a case of
really
looking into the abyss and having the abyss look into me. Is what you're saying?
Yes. So he's gone in directions, and you can. I mean, you can.
I'm looking up the names of some of his art books.
There's an art book literally
grease berries.
There's literally one called Gal Grease, I think, or something like that. I think that's one.
I have never seen a human being love the Dodge tool on Photoshop more than him.
Yeah, he loves like slimy, just gross, greasy people. But anyways, like the original manga had a lot of really weird sort of shit on top of it, and a lot of his other works had like kind of like, yeah, you didn't need to put in this like clearly fetishized like rape scene in here or whatever. Like no, in the first movie and also the sequel movie, like Ghost in the Shell and Ghost in the Shell 2.0 are dry, kind of generic, like really atmospheric, focused, like heady sort of. Just like
the first movie was very important.
It was important,
but going back on it now, it's much rougher than you remember it being.
Yeah,
I'll tell you that.
It's so like nothing happens, and it's just kind of just like
the plot structure of the movie is just kind of like things happen, and then the plot gets resolved at the end.
Yeah, I think it just works better having the length of a TV series and the pacing of it allowed it to do the investigative kind of questioning and prodding aspects a lot better than in a movie was going to be able to do.
A long-form format works a million times better for it, but that's not entirely like the only thing that makes Standalone Complex much better at it, because there's also Ghost in the Shell Arise, which
I have not watched that.
Is real bad in comparison.
I think the best way to describe the Arise is that I was talking with a certain friend of mine on Twitter, and he thought that Arise was a prequel to Standalone Complex, and he was fucking like. He said it was literally the only time he has ever been disappointed by an animated work, like in general. And he doesn't watch anime really, other than like stuff like Standalone Complex. And he was fucking like literally made him emotionally sad that he thought that it was part of Standalone Complex. He was very happy to learn that it was, in fact, unrelated in the sense of, like, oh, it didn't ruin the real Bato or anything like that.
But the part of, like, the worst part about it is that that's absolutely true that it's not, but the way that Arise presents it, it's very, like, like, wink, wink, nudge, nudge, this could be a prequel, you know, when you think
It's
about
not,
it, and
though,
like,
when you
it
think
wants to be, but it isn't.
Yeah, like, timeline-wise, it also doesn't make any sense, but yes, it's kind of builds itself up as, like, kind of a prequel concept to Standalone Complex, but it just doesn't work at all, and the characters don't work at all, and, like,
God, the character writing is garbage in it. Like, that's the
like, all
worst
the
part about it.
subtlety of, like, Standalone Complex is fucking gone. It is, like, the
Like,
least subtle,
Well,
like,
it also seems like that the way Standalone Complex versus the movie versus, I guess, they're
Arise.
separate universes. They're separate universes. They're not
Yes,
considered.
they are.
There's no timeline that unites all three of them anyway.
I mean, they have the same setting. There's different stories within the same setting. And I would also
Yeah.
say that the other issue with, like, the movies in particular is that they're also directed by Mamoru Oshii, and he's got a very particular style that personally I cannot fucking stand.
A whole lot of sections of nothing happening.
Yeah, just kind of like sitting and, like, you know.
In both movies, there is like a 5-minute stretch where literally nothing is happening, and there's admittedly really good tunes going on because Kenji Kawai is a really good composer. But that's it. Like, it's just scenes of the world with a track on it, and that's
And
it.
also,
Well, in
Kenji
this
Kawai
case,
is
I think also Standalone Complex has Yoko Kanno.
Kenji
You
Kawai,
can't top her. Like,
no.
Yeah, Kenji Kawai is a good composer, Yoko Kanno, and like this was Yoko Kanno at her peak.
Yoko
like,
Kanno is a
really
fucking
good.
goddess.
she's still really good. I don't.
Yeah, but she's not like
She doesn't do that much.
Terror.
Not
Yeah,
as
Terror
much.
and Resonance soundtrack, for instance, is not even close to being as good.
Well, to be fair, it's also like a lot of the stuff is like the end of Standalone Complex is like she had like a 2 to 3 year lead in to get the music ready for both like seasons. That's that is absurd to some
Well,
degree.
then she also did Space Dandy. So
Did do Space Dandy. I mean, she didn't do all the music in Space Dandy though.
Nah, like
Yeah.
I wasn't aware that she worked on Space Dandy at all.
she did. The
okay.
ending theme was her, and I think a few of the tracks were.
Yeah.
All right, fair enough. Like Space Dandy did have good music, so like
though it
maybe
is worth.
part.
One part of the thing with Yoko Kanno is the sort of unrelated to this, but like the whole thing with her is that for the longest time she was collaborated very heavily with her husband, who was also a composer, and that roughly her divorce with him roughly corresponded with when she exited doing a ton of music for like animation. So there might be a relationship there in the sense of like, okay, she became slightly less prolific.
Yeah, she just kind of she left the world a bit and seemed to just live her life differently.
Which is
but in general though, like it's just
she's absurdly astounding as an artist. Yes.
Yeah. And then I think the director for Standalone Complex was a guy who used to work at what was it? He worked at Ghibli as like a background artist at one point.
Yes, I believe so. Yes, Kenji
That's,
Kamiyama.
Yes, yeah.
That's pretty high praise.
He worked at. I think it was
graphics are
actually
great.
technically. Was it actually at Ghibli that he ended up working, or is that at Studio?
I think he did
Fuga?
stuff. I think he did some stuff for Kiki's Delivery Service, but I mean,
I don't think that was Ghibli yet, was it?
I think.
Or was that? Or
I
was
think
he
Kiki's
doing...
Delivery Service was the first movie when they were Ghibli, wasn't it? Or was
Okay,
that
wait, no,
before
sorry.
also?
The issue was that the backgrounding was technically a separate studio. doing
Oh
it.
right, yeah.
Okay.
In Japan,
He
a lot of
worked
the
at-
backgrounds are separate.
Yeah. So I mean, yes, Kenji Kamiyama is a fantastic director.
Yeah.
He also did Eden of
holy
the
crap.
East. He's
Oh,
done a
I
lot-
forgot about that. Yeah.
So he's done a lot of really good stuff. He worked with certain other stuff. I think another key thing is that the script writing for this show and like a lot of the storyboard staff is also astounding. There's a lot of people who worked at on things like Cowboy Bebop.
Oh God, yeah.
My favorite scriptwriter of all time worked on this show. In fact, Dai Sato, who also did work with the person who did the story writing for much of Bebop. He did a lot of stuff for Space Dandy. He did all of Eureka 7. He's a astounding scriptwriter.
And not the second version of
Not the
Eureka
we don't fucking talk about that. Not on this podcast. He also did a lot of script writing, good episodes for that Fujiko Mine Lupin OVA. Dai Sato is great.
Very
He also
interesting.
did a lot of stuff on Samurai Champloo. So it's kind of like
Gotcha.
that sort of circle.
Basically, production IG at this point in its history, in particular, was kind of like an all-star collection of excellent artists.
Well, it was also an
I would say
example
they
of
kind
like,
of rivaled Madhouse at the time.
well,
Yeah,
also I think like there are certain works that occasionally happen in anime where you see where they kind of like somehow either do like the funding or like something happens where they're like, okay, we're bringing in everybody. Like, oh, you mean everybody in the company? Like, no, we're getting everybody in like the animation industry to work on this. And it's
yeah.
like you look at like
Passion
this.
projects, like like that.
Yeah,
I
you look at
love
like this. You
those.
look at like the staff of like Ghost in the Shell standalone complex, like who did like the in betweening or like who did the animation. You look at it, it's like, holy shit, there's like fucking like 50 studios that worked on this.
Yeah.
Hmm.
Well, it's
Like
like I
not
would
even
say again,
joking.
like even comparing it to Space Dandy makes sense too, because like look at all the people they brought in for that one
Yeah,
too.
exactly. Like
Like it's
that's
just
a
I
good
love
comparison.
An
it when they
even
do that.
more, an even more recent example of that was the One Punch Man anime. Did basically the same thing, where they brought in a ton of very, very talented animators
Sure.
to
And
Yeah.
work on the
and
show.
that happened with Bebop. That happened with
Yep.
Eureka 7. Like you look at it, it's like kind of like okay, somebody basically called in like their shots or like all the favors that they were owed or something, and just basically every piled in. It also happened with Gurren Lagann as well, where it's kind of like you look at the staff, like oh yeah, like everybody worked on an episode of this. Like literally everybody in the anime industry that's like competent, like all like because that's something that happens. Like that happened with a Kill la Kill even, where it's like kind of like somebody on the staff knows people because they were there for a while, and then that person that they know called in someone else that they knowed, and then just basically everybody dogpiles on. And that was kind of that's something that's happened pretty often with like Studio Trigger, for example, with like certain shows where they're like kind of like, oh, we need somebody, we need to get there, we want this to be a phenomenal artistic work to some degree, and then they just basically bring in everybody they possibly can.
Well, like
Mhm.
I don't know if you've seen this, but there was the recent series called Shirobako, which was about people in the anime industry and things like that. And one of the things you see, because one of the characters is basically kind of like a production runner or a production assistant, is how much of them are making those connections to like, oh, I know this one animator who's really good at this. I'll give them a call for this scene and things like. You could see how someone would build up that
Right.
Rolodex essentially, and how you could go like, oh, this person, oh, for this director, yeah, I'll do it for this guy. I really like his stuff. Like that show does a really great job of showing how those connections and how production designer people align to finish these projects. It's a show I'd recommend, but another day. But
Yep.
in general, like yeah, people build up these connections and they form a Rolodex. I mean, it's kind of like what an art director in the West would be. So like you build up a catalog of people that you can rely on that you know are really good at certain things and you know when to call upon them.
So I don't know if it's necessarily that there's a single person that kind of does that sort of thing, and so much as like a lot of these people in this industry have been there forever, and so
Yeah.
they have like these sort of friends. Like, yeah, I know, so and so. I worked with him on so and so sensei's work, back in like 1980. Yeah, we're friends. I helped them out with a thing when they were on during a crunch previously, or they were working on like a film, and they asked me if I would do a couple scenes for them, like. Look at Redline, for example, which was
Oh
a
yeah.
totally a passion pop project. Like
Was that IG or Madhouse?
That was Madhouse. That was
Madhouse.
Madhouse.
I
Madhouse
I
passion project
confuse
over
those.
7 years.
I confuse IG and Madhouse a lot because they remind me of each other in terms
yeah,
of they're both highly technical studios that have probably some of the best production designers
yeah,
Mhm.
that I
and
can
that
think of.
was that was a total passion project from Takeshi Koike, and he obviously brought in a lot of people that he had like friends with because you had like cameos from like the different like say the Studio Trigger guys doing like one scene in there. They have a lot of that sort of stuff because otherwise like a lot of stuff was him animating it all on his own. So the only people he got was like people of his caliber that joining in to some degree. And then
Mhm.
ultimately he ended up doing guest work on other series as well. Kind of like because it's a give and take.
Yeah.
And it's an interesting thing that somehow we got off of this about talking about Bato.
It,
We got off of it talking about
it's
more about
hard.
the major at that point.
Yeah.
But
It's
Yeah.
difficult because again there's so many things going on at the same time. You have the central mystery, I mean, I ended up not being really interested in it. It's kind of like one of those things where I don't know if you've ever seen the movie Tinker Tailor Soldier Spy.
No.
I
Um,
have not.
a lot of people, when they watched it, they got really confused because they couldn't really follow the nitty gritty of the connections and all the spy escapades. But the thing is that the movie wasn't really about that. It was about the emotional journey and the philosophical journey and things like that. This show, I think, is very similar in that it's not as important in the end to understand like all the direct connections and the names and who gets money from what. It's much more about the character's emotional journey and a sense of responsibility. So you have the character, the Laughing Man, in this case, where who he was idealistically, what responsibility did he feel. It was about that. It wasn't about necessarily how he pulled it off. It was more about how he feels like interacting with that world after he did what he did, and what he had done had escaped him and become its own thing.
I think it is important, like the mystery of the sense, like I think the way that it's ultimately cap-ended is interesting in the fact that, like, there's explicitly a question that Togusa asked in the last episode, like, exactly how did this make the world a better place? And it's like, it didn't. There is no happy ending to this show at all.
I mean, there's only a slight one in that, the whole thing, it was a Pyrrhic victory.
It was a Pyrrhic victory, but in many senses, though, in the sense like...
Oh, it didn't change anything, yeah.
All they really did was they replaced I think it was like the Homeland Minister or something like that, or that was his term. Like, all they did was replace him with someone else.
Yep.
That's really all they ended up doing.
And ultimately end up getting prosecuted. But the thing is also, they also had that cap in that one of my favorite moments of the final episode is something that they don't explain at all. But I fucking love it in the sense that they have the whole thing where they have God, what is the doctor's name? The guy that got kidnapped several times.
He got killed though, didn't he?
That's
Imakurus?
Yes, no, not Imakurus. The other one.
There's too many names.
Do you remember?
I don't.
I'm talking about what's his face that wasn't Dido. It was.
Serrano.
Serrano, yes.
That's it. Yes.
Serrano genomic suit.
Yeah, they have the whole thing where Serrano finally makes the revelation that, okay, he needs to actually assist this because, for all in all, he ultimately did have like a moral value of like, yeah, he's ostensibly part of like this cyberpunk corporation kind of and running it, but he does actually have values. He does actually want to improve things for people. The actually way that they handle Serrano, I think, is actually really interesting in the sense that they kind of explore the fact that the whole reason, like, a lot of that kidnapping happened early on to some degree is, like, the sense that he was willing to engage the Laughing Man for, like, basically so long, like, during the kidnapping, kind of, like, he could have tried escaping, but he kind of was, like, willing to...
He was so interested in what this guy was telling.
What would drive someone to do that? And he ultimately ended up being convinced to some degree that, he didn't act on it, but it kind of took him a while to kind of come to terms with, like, what he needed to do. But the whole thing is, like, he ended up ultimately, confessing and, willing to, assist the prosecutor general on that shit. And then the end of the fucking episode, he gets fucking assassinated and they don't show it or explain why or who. It's
like, he's about to get into a car and then assumedly a car bomb goes off.
You hear the sound and you see a guy walking away that they do not explain what his deal is. Maybe he's one of the CIA guys, but they don't say that. They don't make it clear. It's just like this guy walking away basically saying like, oh yeah, the thing you have to remember about having moral code is that it's a good way to get fucking killed.
Yep.
It's like the fucking just like, yeah, the happy end that you're going for, yeah, maybe the guy's going to get prosecuted, but all the people that would, again, incriminated, most of them are going to get away because fucking shit is corrupt.
Yeah. And because Serrano dies at the end, the statement that going into the actual nitty gritty of the show, the same as that the Mirai vaccine was actually effective and the micro machines for the longest time didn't have any effect whatsoever.
Well, I mean,
that never comes out. I think it was.
It might come out, but the whole fact that it was being deliberately covered up won't, because they end up leaking all the details to the media and stuff like that, which ends up getting the prosecution. Mm-hmm. But whether or not they're actually able to incriminate all the other people that were covering up, because the whole thing they say is that a lot of the government was into that cover up and was ultimately profiting off of it.
Whether there's the list of all the people that had received the vaccine, and they were like, okay, I recognize all these names in here, holy shit, this goes so far.
Yeah, so they don't make clear, maybe Section 9 would do something about it. They never touch on it. They never even touch about the fact that, did Serrano die there? They don't say what ultimately happens. They just you hear a noise, and you have the guy walking away basically being, the good way to end up having a short life. but they don't actually go into what the fuck happened there, and they never touch it on in the second season or anything, and that is so good. I love the fact that they don't explain shit that they don't need to. They don't build up like, oh yeah, clearly this happened, and epilogue, tail end, we'll ultimately explain every bit of minutia about how this all resolves. Like, nah, we'll give you hints about where this could have gone, but ultimately, that's not the kind of story we're telling. This is a gritty, cyberpunk-ass fucking dystopian future.
It's doubly the case because the final episode is literally nothing but an epilogue, but it's an epilogue that is so good.
It's an epilogue about Togusa.
Yeah, it's an epilogue about Togusa in particular, but it's an epilogue in general too, just because there's the final section of the show where this happens. They whether or not Section 9 is even going to get rebooted at some point is kind of left up in the air. All of it is very, very vague, and it's vague in the exact perfect way, kind of like how we were talking about at the very start when we were talking about it, that it is the perfect example of what makes cyberpunk good.
Yeah. Well, here's the interesting thing is when it comes to the politics of the series, it's often very difficult for me to really place it, and I'd say I don't think of that as a bad thing. It's just it's interesting. It has a lot of interesting, I think, things to say about kind of capitalism. I think especially when you look at the scandal and how corrupt it is and how much it hand-tied Serrano as much as it did, I think was interesting. But at the same time, you also have the amount of wealth and things like that for people who have the ability to even get the cyberization. So you have a class system that starts developing. There's some interesting thoughts on that, but then you also have some weird, some weird references to some specific Japanese politics, like that when that Chinese minister visits the shrine for the war dead. I think it's not the exact same shrine, but I think it's a reference to a famous shrine in Japan that is very well known for being a controversial place for about war dead and the rape and Nanking and all sorts of other things.
I mean, it's not meant to be the exact same thing, but they're kind of reflecting on in reverse. Yeah,
it's a strange reference to that. You have a little bit of Section 9 can do whatever it wants, but it works out well in the end without oversight. It's like, I mean, I kind of get it, but at the same time, I go, I'm a little.
I mean, I think that's kind of deliberate. Like that aspect of it is really interesting in the sense that Section 9 could very easily, in most other cyberpunk work, be the
horrible
bad guys.
Yes,
they would be the bad guys. They are the antagonists of another work, and half the guys they're arresting are what the protagonists of other cyberpunk works would be.
Yeah.
And ultimately, the guys who end up cracking down on Section 9 in the last couple episodes are essentially just another form of Section 9 within the Navy. They're just another black ops
No, they
unit.
were DEA. They were the drug enforcement.
Well, no,
agencies.
not those guys. The Umibozu.
The Umibozu.
Oh, right, okay.
Yeah, the guys that they got ultimately.
They were just Navy versions of
Section 9. They were basically a black
9,
ops unit that was owned by the Navy. That someone called the strings in to get access to them when the DEA you basically fell through and got all got basically arrested and cracked down on, and that's super interesting. That the fact that they're just doing their jobs as well to some degree. They are in the morality of Section 9 in general is a really interesting thing to try to explore because they are breaking the law constantly.
Yes, that's what I mean. So it's one of those things where it's they are the protagonists, and it works out well that they are able to do what they need to and want to do. But then
the possibility
of how awful it would be otherwise. Yeah.
If they were to slip up even once, they could become horrendous.
Yeah.
The way I every so often when I describe the setting of Ghost in the Shell to other people, I will say it's cyberpunk, but viewed from 180 degrees the opposite direction. Mm-hmm. It's all of the punk in cyberpunk, that is all still completely there in Ghost in the Shell, but you're viewing it from the perspective of the police.
To some degree.
The
police here are also very punky in the sense of Section 9 itself gets into some really heady shit. The whole thing with the Tachikomas, they ultimately end up shutting them down because they get a little too punky to some degree, you could say. But the whole concept of some of the stuff they explore, the Major in particular is seems very willing to basically go, rules and laws. Like, she has a moral code, but she's super willing to just completely just, like, she beats up a lot of innocent people occasionally when it's to her own advantage. Like, she kind of beats up like a British cop for no damn reason when he wasn't doing anything there. He was just there, just, making sure nobody was entering past his cordon. And she went up to that guy naked, basically, and then fucking knocks his ass out.
Yeah.
That guy wasn't doing anything. He was just there, like, making sure nobody was walking into the street where there was, like, a cordon,
Also, one thing I have to say with the dub version of the episode that takes place in England, everyone has American accents. So I was like,
Would you prefer if they had been like, Core, blimey, mate?
No, it doesn't need that,
it's like
but just
4
at least
years in the future.
I know, but it was just a weird little. It was just a small detail where I go like, you don't need like super like thick accents, but at least go like they're in England. There's a slight accent in the dub.
Yeah,
like, it's the English
I
dub.
think that's also I think that's also a thing that I don't know if like. All right, so this is going to be talking about the second season a tiny bit. Like, I think the attitudes of how Funimation was... I think it was Funimation who did this dub. How they were doing dubbing between the 2 seasons changed a fair bit, because characters actually do end up with, like, different accents and whatnot in the second season.
Gotcha.
So I think it was just a, like, not a stylistic thing, but a production side thing on Funimation's side and during the first season.
I'm just saying, like, it's such a small detail, but it was something I noticed that was kind of funny to me.
Yeah, they just didn't bother. Probably for the better, honestly, at the time.
Oh, yeah, I'm sure.
Speaking of accents, I love you, Jameson.
I love you, Jameson. Jameson Bot.
I love the fact that they're like, oh yeah, he's from Osaka. Heavy Texan accent. That's how it works in anime.
Oh, yeah. That's
and then they even have the major call attention to the fact that the accent was fake as shit.
Or no, I remember that now. Yeah, that was great.
That was the major.
Was it the major?
I can't remember. Yeah. She was the one who called it out. I think Togusa was convinced. I want to meet the guy who thought that the first like cyborg body should just be a box with arms that aren't even articulated.
I mean, what are you gonna do? Like,
I mean, at least give them elbows.
It could tell.
Well, that's because he didn't give a shit. That was his thing. Is he didn't care.
He liked being a shitty little robot box.
I can respect that. It's one of those manly quirks that all those macho guys have, right?
Yeah, exactly. Do you want to... So, I think maybe, there's a lot of characters we haven't touched on, but I think, the big ones we have to touch on is we need to talk about the Tachikomas.
Okay.
The Tachikomas and I think Aramaki is worth talking about, too. The Tachikomas have more important.
Well, like, honestly, the best Aramaki episode is the one where he's in England. Like, that's where you kind of get why he is who he is and why he's so competent at, that's a pretty good one. But
he is the dude who is immune to red tape.
Yeah, but also just his strategic thinking in that episode is pretty fantastic.
Like, the other thing with like, Aramaki is kind of a good reflection of like Section 9 in the sense like he has character. He does do skullduggery shit, but like the whole thing is like him is that he's still also just looking out for the kind of the general good, and defining the general good is kind of skeezy to some degree. But then again, we're also talking about a government where everybody is in the know that it's kind of fundamentally flawed and corrupt.
Yeah.
And in that case, what's the, how much better can you do? Like, when the rule of law is being subverted by the people making the laws, let's not look too much at modern day society here. Let's not make this too dark. But if the rule of law is being subverted by the people who make the laws, what exactly is the point of trying to follow it to the letter? Like the whole, when the rule of law is going to fail because everybody else is corrupting it, the only way you're going to find anything approaching justice might just be having to kind of bend the rules occasionally. Which is kind of, I think, the idea. And he does that same sort of thing in, that England episode where his whole thing is that he's working with criminals and basically going around the cops because he expects them to try to kill them. And then ultimately he lets them go because what's the point? Like, the legal standpoint there is kind of like, yeah, maybe he should be doing stuff there. Or maybe he should have, if the legal thing should have been, like, oh, yeah, detain them or something. But ultimately, no, he's just trying to make things better for, his friend and also hopefully come to there being some semblance of justice. And if there's some, worms you have to get through the cracks,
Well, that also, it's not his jurisdiction.
Yeah, exactly. So
There's not too much to talk about with Armaki, but he is a really entertaining
he is
character
an
once he
entertaining
gets the
guy, and I
spotlight.
like the stuff that they did with the entrapment stuff
Yeah.
with his brother. They go into it
Yeah.
more in the second season. Again, obviously, uh, I, I think the Tachikomas are super interesting in the sense that they add a lot of the character to the series, and they kind of like, add like a real.
Well, they become a secondary entry point for the audience, I think, as well.
Sure.
So
'Cause
their development understanding kind of mirrors our development and understanding of how things are working.
Sure.
hmm
And they're just really just kind of fun and like it's
They're also
interesting having this-
adorable as shit because they're based off of jumping spiders.
Yeah.
They're
They're
based off of jumping spiders with like the personality of puppies,
yeah.
with like the knowledge of like a bunch of philosophers that have a bunch of machine guns attached to them. So there are a whole bunch of really good traits to have in a character thrown all into one big pile.
Yeah, and it's like it feels like to some degree like they kind of capitalize on like sort of like the sort of moe concept of like, oh yeah, you have like this sort of infantile character, but they don't really approach it in that direction of it being like, oh yeah, this is meant to be something you're supposed to be like attracted to or trying to protect. Like no, like the Tachikomas are treated more as like these interesting entities that they kind of use more as a way to focus attention on Bato because they're all obsessed with Bato. And that further builds up the character and the dynamic between them and Bato, and really establish who Bato is. And like, Bato is the kind of person that robots would just come to love because he's that kind of guy.
Well, I think they also do a lot of great ways of doing kind of explanation of how society works, and they also get into helping describe the philosophy and psychology of Bato in certain ways, as you were saying. Like, I think they're the ones who talk about, or at least bring up the concept of recognizing a sense of self through physical objects and things like that.
Sure, and they're also the kind of the springboard that they use for going into a lot of the deeper sort of quasi navel gazy kind of philosophy of like what makes someone human. Because the whole like kind of conceit of the series is that what separates humans and like brains and like copies of human brains is that there is something of a digital soul to some degree, like a spark of life that can't just be replicated necessarily as easily. Like you can clone a body, but do you necessarily clone what makes a person human and alive? And their argument is essentially no, because we have a sort of quantifiable like a ghost, the ghost in the shell is what they kind of use for it, and that's semblance of the brain, and that they use often the Tachikomas are the ones kind of reflecting on the sense of like, oh yeah, we don't have ghosts. We are simple machines. We are super smart, but we're just AI. We're just
we can't
algorithms
experience death
because we're not really alive. And ultimately, they end up, kind of towards the end, Mater reflects that again. Maybe they actually were truly alive in the end because they were capable of, undergoing something, as complex as self-sacrifice, and defying their own rules and like regulations and and restrictions just because they care about somebody essentially.
Mm-hmm.
And that
even
last
if
episode,
they don't end up exactly understanding the basics of it. But yeah, no, that was a pretty, yeah.
the Tachikoma sacrifices are like really fucking emotional. Like that still gets me really well. Also knowing like where they end up going with that, it still gets me.
Oh yeah, it doesn't deplete the meaning of the act.
Yeah.
Yeah. Tachikomas are real good.
Yeah, I agree. The fact that they're jumping spiders is a super intelligent choice because jumping spiders are cute in general, and then they made a robot jumping spiders, and then like gave them like sort of quasi-human, like their mannerisms are pseudo-human,
Mm-hmm.
like where they kind of like they'll do like things that are like idle movement that wouldn't make sense for a robot, but works, and it also just kind of funny in the sense of like, yeah, this isn't a human body doing this. But it's emulating it.
It's a mimicry of
Yes.
human behavior as best as they can understand it.
Mm-hmm.
A little point of being kind of like slightly impressed by the character writing on the show, specifically for the Tachikomas. A couple of the Tachikomas actually do have like character quirks that they do every now and again. Like the one that Bato particularly likes is he has a favorite unit. That one actually salutes every now and again, basically.
Well, then there's the one that collects books and things like that.
Yeah, there's the one that collects books, but I mean specifically like those, and then there's like the one that likes to twirl its hand around a whole lot. It's like I'm kind of impressed by them giving every now and again like specific character ticks to each individual Tachikoma that you don't see very often.
Well,
Because you only really see like 3 of the 9.
That's like good character acting and character animation.
Yeah,
Like they
I'm
thought
just
about
pointing it
that,
out.
which is really nice. Yeah, I mean, I agree. It's such a great, thoughtful thing for them to have included in the characterization.
Yeah, and that also really goes really well with the sort of general philosophical conceit they kind of explore with the series, in the sense that like the whole thing, like one of the big ultimate philosophical messages that Ghost in the Shell standalone complex, the first season at the very least, was that it's an exploration of how like sort of mimetic information, and how if we were able to connect our brains to the internet, we would possibly kind of learn to kind of fall into like the same sort of patterns, and like like,
Well, you would lose a sense of self.
yeah, and the notion of both a loss of a sense of self and also the fact that there could theoretically be such a thing as a cultural disease, like something.
Well,
like
that's what mass hysteria, folie à deux,
exactly.
things like that exist in current psychology.
Certainly.
Just that this would be such because like. But the thing is that what keeps that stuff from becoming as bad as it is because we have a physical separation of our bodies, and
Sure.
our minds being enclosed in our bodies, as opposed to being able to directly physically connect like that, prevents that stuff from spreading like as a virus as it does in this.
Yeah, and the interesting way is that they kind of sort of like, yeah, and like the Tachikomas all have identical forms. They have no point of reference. They even do everything they can to essentially quash their sense of identity.
Every single day, they actually end up having to synchronize all of their knowledge and experiences.
Yeah, and so essentially they all can't distinguish who interacted with a person. But the thing is that, and something that they touch, also looking at the whole standalone complex itself, with all the Laughing Man imitators and stuff, is that the reason when people are able to really separate their identity, and even with things like losing your identity in the internet, they use as a kind of like a end game scenario, since like such a thing as like your relationships with other people, it's a point of reference that differs you, and even fundamentally like people's brains and how people think, even when they are exposed to different information, can still separates them from other people, because they kind of touch on this as like simple curiosity is enough to separate identity between human beings. And you see that with the Tachikomas, like the things that they're interested in at a whim. Like whims is what ultimately separates the differences between them, and that causes them to kind of separate in terms of their who they are. They are the same people, but the directions that they take their whims ultimately causes them to be different.
Yeah. I pretty much agree with that take overall.
Yep.
I find it also interesting that in the last episode, they do actually, the Togusa becomes another Laughing Man imitator, even though he's the one with the least cybernetics, and he's the one least doing internet bullshit. But even he kind of falls to like the sort of sociological the catch of the Laughing Man, of the appeal of the sort of what kind of drives people to imitate it, even though he was not should have been kind of separated from that to some degree from that stuff. And him being also the most rational and grounded person, even he kind of falls into that same sort of chain of that sequence of imitation without actually intending it, and do imitation without an original.
Yeah,
they do go into it a little bit that it's not just on the internet where all that was happening, because like the Laughing Man symbol turned into a pop icon in universe. Like everyone started using that as the new smiley face, basically. It's like this design just kind of popped up, and then like since there was attributed to this one one criminal or whatever, he obviously couldn't take like any kind of copyright on it, so everyone just started using it, and then it spread to everyone else.
It became co-opted
it
by
it is the traditional. Yeah, it is.
And then it became pop culture, and then became general culture, because that's how things go. Like,
and then it lost all its meaning.
Yeah, it is like a visual representation of like the classical idea of what a meme is.
Yeah. That's a good way of putting it. Memetic thinking.
It's super interesting the way that they explore it in this series, in the sense that they also really want to. They both say like, the internet makes it so much easier for these sort of things to potentially take hold of people, because when you're literally suffused with information, and there's so little separating what people are, it becomes so much easier for people to kind of catch on and kind of push these sort of data points. But then with Togusa, he's not really involved in that sort of stuff. Like, he just kind of like falls into it because there's sometimes certain things just feel fundamental to the human condition, and kind of fundamental to how our brains work. and that's kind of the expression of like what memetic information is, and like how memes propagate.
Well, I think what it was is that there was kind of like a sense of, I think in this case, the specificity to what the meme is of the Laughing Man is a sense of justice. And a sense of revolution in that regard. Well, maybe not revolution, but I think a sense of justice. And looking at the events and how things ended up, you can kind of see why he comes to the conclusion he does in an oddly logical way. It's nice because it also when you see the imitators, they're kind of treated a little bit as a comedy thing, but then when you see at the end when he goes through it, you kind of go, oh wait, it actually is a lot more dramatic and complex and not as funny as it was originally kind of,
Yeah, because not even the so-called original Laughing Man is the actual original Laughing Man. That was just an idea he found that someone wrote up and left on a server somewhere.
Like he added the imagery to the things, but like all these Laughing Mans are kind of built upon each other. Like there's no original, but it's like kind of concatenating out into existence, like out of nothing. This thing is born, and then everybody's kind of changing what it actually is, and ultimately, the threat to it is less the fact that this is a thing, but it's more the fact that there are forces that could easily second it and take advantage of it, and then
and that was the big part
game,
was
which
trying
is the
to use
twist,
that to inflate and short their own stocks and things like that.
Exactly.
It was an idea that then was adopted and then used basically as corporate subterfuge.
Yeah. So basically, it was about ideology being co-opted by capitalism. I think there's some interesting things to be said about it in this case, about how it does, though. I mean, even the original logo seemed to be derived from their version of Starbucks.
Their version of Starbucks with just a Catcher in the Rye quote on it.
Well, yeah. So I thought that was kind of an interesting way they did that. There's just a lot going on. I mean, it's a series I definitely recommend. You can, again, watch it on Hulu in the dubbed version. You could probably find the subtitles somewhere. I don't know in terms of DVD, unfortunately.
Not really available right now. It's kind of out of print.
Yeah, which is unfortunate.
It's been out of print for a fair while, and it shows up every now and again, just broadcasted on.
But I mean,
Adult
I'm
Swim,
saying like if you're
Adult
trying to
Swim has
find
permanent broadcast.
Well, I'm talking about in terms of getting the subtitled version, because that's
Yeah, okay. The subtitle version is really hard to find because you can also find the dub episodes 6 through 26. Manga Entertainment just kind of uploaded to their channel on YouTube.
Okay, because you can see
oddly
the
enough,
dub
the first
anywhere.
5 you can't find there, but
weird.
I'm sure there are places where you could in fact find the subtitled version. If you
can't easily.
Yeah. Yes, you could.
Yeah. A couple of little minor things I want to point out, just like some minor little thing, is that I love the really weird attention to detail that they have in places where other series would probably not do it. The boxer episode has a scene early on where they're boxing in the gym, and they get the sound of shoes on a rubber floor, tennis shoes on a rubber floor, when they're doing their sparring just right. And they time it pretty perfectly for their motions.
Oh, so the Foley art, you mean?
Yeah, exactly. This good sound, but also the way it's timed matches with how they're moving, and you never see their feet actually moving during all this.
Yeah.
It's such a detail. It's like, oh, yeah, it's good that they're showing this. Like, they didn't have to actually show the feet there because, like, for one, again, it's television anime. That's probably a little out of their budget range. But the fact that they took the attention to detail to go like, yeah, it would sound like this, and it would be timed, given their motion like this, I don't think that's necessarily a level of detail that other shows would have.
Yeah, that's a fair point. Like, it is honestly a kind of unnecessary. Well, not unnecessary. It is unnecessary, but it is an excellent thing to throw in. Because you imagine that not only would that be out of the budget, that would probably be terrible framing if they were to show the entire body the entire time and stuff like that, or just shots of their feet every now and again.
It'd be so easy also to forget just to include that sound at all. Like, it's kind of like, oh yeah, they're just boxing on a floor, and it's like, no, they're in a gym. You would sound like gym sparring. So you would have a rubber floor, and that would sound like tennis shoes on a rubber floor because clearly they would be wearing tennis shoes in this situation. And just like that level of detail. And I also love the way that they handle blood so much in this with smearing, in the rain or smearing on surfaces. Like that would be a detail that they wouldn't necessarily had to have included, but it really sells things well. It sells.
It's really good about heads exploding.
Yeah. Well, again, it's all this attention to detail that grounds it. It makes it feel like it's a believable universe. It's all those small things that kind of it's the concept of verisimilitude. It's the idea of all the small little details that make us start believing in something as a reality as opposed to being entirely a fictive thing. So it's again, I think it comes down to just that was the production design. That's also just the people behind it giving a shit to actually make those observations and think about that.
Yep.
Mm-hmm.
It's a very special series, I think, in that regard, and that's one of those things I really like about it.
Yeah.
So again, I highly recommend it. You can watch the dub version on Hulu with no problem. So the subtitles, good luck. I think that about wraps it up as much as we can really get into it. So anything else?
We could go, like, if you wanted to, you could go, like, every couple of episodes or whatever, but that would just there's not really much reason to do that. Like,
No,
the Ghost in the Shell standalone complex is a thing that you can really easily talk about just as the whole. You don't really need to get into the nitty-gritty of the episodes, even though each individual ones are really good.
Yeah, there's a lot of good individual episodes. I would say that it's interesting looking back at it now, that the sense that I think Second Gig in general has a lot better standalone episodes, and I think it's also a lot better directed, but I think the core story of the first season feels a bit better, though.
Yeah, I like the Laughing Man storyline better than the individual 11 one.
I agree with that, but I still have a preference overall for the second season.
I agree.
For the same reason that you just said, basically. It's a completely up to taste thing, I want to say.
I think it's the second season is just in general just much better directed. Like the actual
which is saying a lot.
Yeah, the first season is really well directed, but the second season, like the actual direction. I mean, maybe we'll have to go Dada sometime and talk about Second Gig, but that'll have to be some other time, I think.
Yeah, definitely.
So, all right. So that's definitely no one recommends this one. No. So I think that's about it. So let's talk about what we're going to be doing next time. This is going to be something I'm very excited about, and it's probably my still absolute favorite series of all time, Paranoia Agent by Satoshi Kon. Unfortunately, good luck trying to find it anymore. DVDs are no longer in production. No one is streaming it, so internet time for everybody.
Yeah. There's not really any other way to get to it. Like, broadcasting rights are currently kind of up in the air even, so it'd be even hard to... Like, even if, like, a year from now they start airing it, well, whatever, it's a year from now. We're not doing it right now. Like, there's almost no way to get at it without going a little bit gray legality there.
Yes. So, that's what we'll be talking about next week, so I'm very excited about that. Other than that, any plugs?
Nope, I'm just an asshole.
Well, let's at least get your Twitter handle if you have one.
I'm at Mighty Dicktron on Twitter. It's not... I don't tweet anything really aside from the occasional piece of artwork. That's it.
Hey, something to see.
I'm not that great of a drawsman.
Aww. I don't think I am either.
Says the animator. Alright.
So, alright, so we will see you guys next week.